start with the Pope. Everyone should start with the Pope. About 3 years ago, this was one of his more famous tweets. Inequality is the root of social evil. And I would say that captures one of the critical questions of our time. And I want to kind of subdivide that question, make it a bit more, or that claim, and make it a bit more concrete. And I think there are three sort of hypotheses that are embedded within that claim of the Pope. And the first one is what might be called the economy question. And here what's at stake is whether or not rising inequality is reducing the total economic output by increasing the capacity of those at the top to engage in corruption, rent-seeking behavior, to implement sweetheart deals, and otherwise extract things for themselves, but in ways that don't increase the total economic output, right? So it gives a lot of capacity at the top to engage in that type of resource extraction, and in ways that don't increase the output. So that's the first question, the economy question, and the idea is, inequality might be reducing our capacity to build strong economies. Second question is the democracy question. And again, I'm just kind of subdividing the Pope's tweet into more concrete social science hypotheses. So the democracy question is the second line of questioning that should worry us when it comes to understanding what rising inequality is all about. And here the idea is that if rising inequality might amplify the voice of those at the top and undermine any authentic governance by the people. It's obviously a big concern of our time. And then the third concern when it comes to understanding rising inequality is whether it undermines mobility by increasing the capacity of parents who have lots of resources to assist their children and thereby undermine our commitment to equal opportunity. So I'm going to focus in on that last question and treat it not as a claim as the Pope did, but rather let's try to examine the evidence on the question of whether or not our commitment to mobility and to equal opportunity is being undermined by rising inequality. And I'd say, again, this kind of question, the question about what does rising income inequality mean, is one of the core questions of our time. There's no doubt now, it's beyond dispute, that income inequality is in many late industrial countries rising. No doubt about that, rising and rising spectacularly, reaching levels that are unprecedented. That's beyond dispute. But what is in contention, and what I want to take on today, is whether or not that takeoff in income inequality is leading to all sorts of bad outcomes. I listed three here. I want to focus in on the third one, the mobility question. Okay? Now, I should say it is very much a hypothesis. It's by no means obvious that rising income inequality is problematic along a variety of domains. A lot of people think that it's something that is unproblematic, and indeed, Sandy Jenks, one of the most eminent sociologists, weighed in precisely at the time when the Pope weighed in with that tweet that I shared with you, and he said the following in a very famous interview now with the New York Times. He said, "Can I prove that anything is terrible because of rising inequality? Not by the kind of standards I would require." And so this was an interview in which he said, we need to get to the task of actually seriously evaluating whether or not rising income inequality, is having negative effects of the sort that many have hypothesized. But he says, we don't yet have the evidence as to whether or not those postulated effects are indeed in play. And so I want to take up that challenge and lay out the sorts of evidence that are now available on the question of whether or not rising income inequality is problematic when it comes to providing opportunities for mobility. So I'm going to do so with respect to three different types of mobility, three very important types of mobility, each of which I would argue pertains to a particular aspect of the American dream. And for each of those three types, I'm going to lay out why I think the evidence now is very clear on the question of whether or not rising income inequality is reducing that particular type of mobility. Okay, so I'm going to talk about absolute economic mobility. I'm going to talk about relative economic mobility, and then finally occupation mobility. Just to give you a foreshadowing, I'm going to argue with respect to each of these three types of mobility. There's good reason now to be worried about the effects of rising income inequality, in particular that they're acting to reduce mobility. And then I'm going to talk, after I make the case for each of those three types of mobility, I'm going to talk about what we can do about it. So let me start with absolute economic mobility. So this could be understood as one aspect of the so-called American dream. And the idea is that children should have a higher standard of living than their parents. So each generation should do better than their parents. What's behind this part of the American dream is the presumption that parents are a very important benchmark for children. We grow up in our parents' household for usually about 18 years. We go back during holidays to visit. And when we're trying to assess how well we're doing, it's often with that benchmark in mind. Are we doing better than the household in which we grew up? And that type of benchmark has been frequently cited as a core part of the American dream, and the idea in particular that every generation should do better than the one that preceded it. So you might think, given how central this type of mobility is to the American dream, you might think that we regularly monitor and report on it. We don't. There's a huge evidence deficit when it comes to assessing whether or not indeed this part of the American dream is indeed eroding, and whether or not rising income inequality is the reason why. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to first talk about how we've overcome this evidence deficit and generated estimates of absolute mobility, and then I'll talk about what it means for the effects of rising income inequality and whether or not it's eroding our commitment to this part of the American dream. So you might think, and you'd be right, there's nothing easier than calculating a measure of absolute mobility. It is so simple. This is all you got to do. Do this and you can write a paper. You just need to measure the household income of the parents when the parents are about age 30, and then compare that to the household income of one of their children, and then just say, is the children's income greater than that of the parents? If it's greater, you've been upwardly mobile. If it's not, you haven't. What could be easier, right? The problem is, and the reason why we haven't been regularly calculating this type of measure of the American dream, is we don't have long series of panel data in which you have measurements of parental income and child income in the same data set. We don't have long series of those of panel data of that sort to affect these comparisons. So what I'm going to do is show how we've overcome this problem by combining administrative and survey data. So you need three separate sources of data in order to make an assessment of absolute mobility. First off, you need the parental income distribution for children of a particular birth cohort. And we're going to get that from the decennial census. Just the distribution of parental household income for each birth cohort. That's step one. Step two, you need the same income distribution for the children when they're age 30, roughly the same age as their parents. We're going to get that from the current population survey. And then you need something that stitches those two together. You need evidence on how it is that a particular origin percentile is converted into a particular destination percentile. That's the so-called copula, and we're going to use de-identified Internal Revenue Service tax returns to get evidence on the copula. So you might say, what the heck is the copula? Well, I'm going to explain it. It's really simple. There's one right up there. That's actually the one we used. You may not be able to read it so there's 10,000 entries in there. It's a 100 by 100 matrix. And the rows are simply the origin percentiles, the parent's income percentile. You can be born into any one of 100. You can be born at the bottom or into the top. And the columns are just the child's income percentile. Okay? And so the copula is just mapping origins into destinations. It's telling us if you're born into a particular origin percentile, what are your chances of ending up in each of the possible 100 destination percentiles? Now, if it were equal opportunity, you would have the same chance of ending up in any of the percentiles for any of the origins, right? So let's just take a look at what the data actually tell us for those very lucky children who are born into the top, the 1%, right? That would be the bottom row there, okay? And I've magnified the first 5 entries in that bottom row and the last 5 as well. So those first 5 entries, the one on the left, they speak to long-range downward mobility. So again, these are people born into the 1%, the richest 1%, or the highest income 1% in the country. And those first 5 cells on the left, they speak to falling all the way down to the bottom 5 percentiles. And as you can see, that's very rare. Only about 1/5 of the percent fall into each of those bottom 5 percentiles. So let's take a look now at so they have to be going somewhere, right? Well, where are these kids going? They're not falling down to the bottom, right? Well, it's probably not surprising that a lot of them are staying up at the top. So you look at the other entries at the far right, and I've magnified them here, and you see that between about 4 and 10% are falling into each of these cells. So just take a look at that far right one, 9.65%. That means that almost 10% of the kids who are born into the 1% are themselves in the 1% when they're adults. 10 times more than you'd expect if there were equal opportunity, as it were, to be in each and every one of the 100 percentiles. So that's the copula. And if we stitch together then these 3 pieces of data, the origin income distribution, the destination income distribution, and then the copula that tells us how you move from origin to destination, if you have those 3 pieces of data, you can calculate absolute mobility. And so that's how we've done it. So what do we get? I'm going right to the results. This is for the 1940 birth cohort. So these are kids born in 1940. And on the bottom, the x-axis, it's the income percentile into which you were born. So there are 100 of those, right? And for each of those percentiles, the y-axis pertains to the proportion of the kids born into that percentile who were absolutely mobile, who made more than their parents, okay? So take a look, just as one example, at children born into the 20th percentile. So this is roughly the threshold of poverty. So children who are, 80% of the parents are doing better than their parents. And you might ask, of those kids who are born into the 20th percentile, the threshold of poverty, what proportion made more money than their parents when the kids were age 30, as were the parents? What proportion? Well, what this chart indicates is that 93% of the kids who were born into the 20th percentile ended up making more than their parents. So this is like the consolation prize. If you're born into poverty in the US in the 1940s, at least you're likely to escape poverty, to do better than your parents. So that's pretty good. What about at the top of the income distribution? Let's take a look at the 95th percentile. In this case, there's still very high level of absolute mobility. 84% of the children made more than their parents, even though their parents were doing very, very well. And if you average across all 100 percentiles, just take the average, 92% of all the kids made more than their parents. So almost everyone was upwardly mobile. This is the American dream, right? This is in 1940, all's well in the United States. Kids are doing better than their parents, 92% of the time. Just 8% didn't do better than their parents. Okay, so now let's take a look at the 1980 birth cohort, so 40 years later. And remember, again, we're comparing kids who are 30 with their parents when they were roughly 30. So this would be kids in 2010. If they're born in 1980, they're going to be 30 years old in 2010. We're taking a look at their income in 2010 now, and we're comparing that to the income of their parents when the parents were also 30. What do we get? Well, so you can see this precipitous drop in the curve from the 1940 to 1980 birth cohort. We also have in between the 50, 60, and 70. I'll just skip that because it's a pretty simple story, right? It just keeps getting worse. So let's take a look at some of the particular statistics. If you're born into the 20th percentile, there's a 57% chance of absolute mobility. That's down from 93%. There's no longer a consolation prize, right? If you're born into the threshold of poverty in the 1980 birth cohort, you have a very healthy chance of remaining in poverty. And then if you look at the 95th percentile, now it's only 27% chance of absolute mobility, down from 84%. And overall, if you average across all percentiles, it's exactly 50% chance of absolute mobility. It's a coin flip now. So that's by way of describing this line of research that I completed with Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, Robert Manduka, Jimmy Narang, and Max Howe. I want to talk a little bit more about that line of research now and go to the key question that I promised to take on, namely, what's the effect of rising income inequality on mobility? So I've just described what the trend is, but now I want to try to understand to what extent rising income inequality might be part of the story when it comes to understanding why rates of absolute mobility have declined. And there are two contending hypotheses here as to what's driving this decline. One is that we just don't have as much economic growth as we had before, and the other is that we have far more inequality than we had before. Which one's to blame disproportionately? That's the question I want to take on. Now, the economic growth hypothesis is pretty plausible, and I want to convince you of its plausibility, and I don't think it'll be hard. It's most people's instinctive account as to why mobility rates went south. So take a look at this graph. It's for the 1940 birth cohort. The blue curve pertains to the parents' income distribution, and then the red one pertains to the children. It's all in 2014 dollars, okay? So the metric's consistent for children and parents. And what do you see? Well, the main thing you see, I would suggest, is this dramatic rightward shift in the distribution. That's economic growth. Children were just, on average, doing a lot better. They're making a lot more money than their parents, okay? To get a sense of just how dramatic this economic growth is, consider that very lucky kid who's born into the 80th percentile. So near the top of the distribution, this is the kid whose parents are doing very, very well indeed. But for whatever reason, let's suppose that kid now doesn't do well compared to other kids in his or her birth cohort. In fact, this kid drops all the way down to the 14th percentile. So 86% of the other members of that birth cohort are doing better than this kid. Right? So compared to all the other members of the birth cohort, he's near the very bottom, even though he or she was born near the very top. What this result, as you can see here by that vertical dotted line, what this kid is still making more than his parent, right? Even though that kid dropped from the 80th percentile to the 14th, there's been so much economic growth during this period that dramatic drop in relative terms doesn't translate into a drop in absolute terms. The kid's still making more than the parents. That's because of economic growth. So this is all by way of making it clear that it may well be that absolute economic mobility rates have dropped because of a decline in economic growth. You're not seeing this kind of dramatic rightward shift in the children's distribution as compared to the parents' distribution now, as was the case in the past in, say, 1940. So let's now carry out the more formal counterfactual analysis and see whether or not economic growth alone can explain the decline in mobility. So here's what we did. We said, let's assume that the children's distribution in 1980 is exactly the same, except that we give it the same amount of growth that obtained in 1940. Okay? So we saw that big rightward shift for the 1940 birth cohort. Let's assume that in 1980, for the 1980 birth cohort, we also get that same rightward shift, which means there's a lot of economic growth. Everything else stays the same. The amount of income inequality stays the same. The way in which that growth is distributed stays the same as now obtains in 1980, but we increase the amount of growth. Just ramp it up to the amount that prevailed in 1940. What happens? Well, that bottom red line is just the the mobility rate in 1980. It's what I already showed you. And that top line is the mobility rate in 1940. So it's that drop in the line that we're trying to explain, right? So then what happens to the line, to the mobility rate, when we give the growth that prevailed in 1940? Well, that's the orange line. And we can see we can make it part of the way back to the 1940 line, but not all that much. The mobility rate goes to, it looks like about 62% overall, which is a far cry from the 92% that prevailed in 1940. So we just can't get that far back to the high rates of the past by simply increasing economic growth to the amount of growth that was in play in 1940. That's just not doing the job. So let's now consider the next possibility. Maybe it's not about the amount of growth, but it's how widely that growth is shared. So now let's say growth in 1980 is just what it was, which was much lower than the amount of growth in 1940. So we'll keep the relatively low growth rate of the sort that you see in all late industrial societies now. Keep the relatively low growth rate. But we now distribute that growth very widely. We distribute it, in fact, exactly like it was distributed in 1940. Much more widely shared economic growth. What happens? Well, that's this green line. Low economic growth rate, just like we have in 1980. That's not changed, but we share that growth widely. Now you see that we can get very close to the absolute mobility rate that prevailed in 1940. Don't get all the way back, but we can get a long way back by just sharing that growth more widely. So here's the instinct. What if your job was to decide on how widely shared the growth should be, with your sole objective being to get the absolute mobility rate as high as it could be? So your job is to decide who's going to get that growth and who's not, and you want an overall mobility rate that's very, very high. What would be the worst thing that you could do? The worst thing that you could do would be to give all the growth to the kid born in the most well-off family, right? That kid would beat their parents, right? But it would be very hard for the other kids to do it because they're not getting any of the growth. So if you don't distribute the growth widely, if you give it all to the folks at the top, you're not going to have a high absolute mobility rate. You're not choosing the kids very wisely with respect to the criterion of maximizing the amount of absolute mobility. Well, that's in effect what we're doing now, right? We're giving all the growth to the top. If you give all the growth to the top, you're not going to have high absolute mobility rates. You're not using your growth wisely insofar as your objective is to maximize the amount of absolute mobility. So that's the instinct. And the upshot is that with respect at least to this type of mobility, absolute economic mobility, it's very clear that rising income inequality matters a lot, that the Pope was right if this is what the Pope was talking about. Okay, so that's the first type of mobility. Now I want to move to the second type. I'm going to refer to relative mobility. So now I'm moving from the research that I carried out with Chetty, Hendren, Manduka, Narang, and Hell, and I'm going to move now to research that was carried out with Pablo Mitnick, Michael Weber, Victoria Bryant, and myself. So what do we mean by relative mobility? The key question here is, to what extent do children who were born into well-off households have an advantage relative to kids who are born into less well-off households? So the measure here, the workhorse measure here, when you care about relative mobility of this sort, is the intergenerational earnings elasticity. What is that? It's just the expected percent change in a child's earnings given a 1% increase in her or his parents' income. So this is how to think about it. Imagine you were just born. The stork is taking you to your new home, and the stork has two choices. The stork can drop you into one household where the income is, say, X, or the stork could take you to another household where the income is X plus 1%. So it's two households identical in all respects, but one of them makes an extra 1%, the parents, okay? Now, if it's the American dream, by this rendition of the American dream, then it wouldn't matter, right? Your expected earnings are going to be the same It does not matter how much your parents make, everyone has the same opportunity, and your expected earnings would be the same. But if that's not the case, let's say the intergenerational earnings elasticity is 1, that would mean that if you're dropped into that household that's making an extra 1%, you can expect yourself to make 1% more than you would make had you instead been dropped into the household that's making just X. Okay? So that would be an elasticity of 1. You get full conversion of the 1% advantage in your parents' income in the form of 1% higher earnings yourself. Okay? If it's 0, if the elasticity is 0, it's the American dream by this rendition of it. Everyone has the same shot. Doesn't matter where they start off. Okay? So remember, my key question is what, if anything, is the effect of rising income inequality on this particular type of mobility? Here, I think it's very important to introduce another variable before I can answer that question, and it's the commodification variable. So the claim here is that the effect of inequality is contingent. I can't just talk about the effect of inequality all by itself. I have to bring in another variable, and that second variable is commodification. And the claim here is that income inequality matters in societies that are highly commodified. So you might ask, what do I mean by a highly commodified society? I'll get right to that. So there are basically 2 ways that you can distribute goods, services, and opportunities. The first is it's just a birthright. Everyone gets, by virtue of being a member of that society, gets that good or service or opportunity. We just think it's a right, and everyone ought to have it. So you might think of, say, in some societies, healthcare is treated in that way. It's just a right. Everyone should get healthcare. But the other way to distribute a good or a service or an opportunity is to say, we'll use the market, and if you have the money, if you put the money on the table, you get it. Okay? So that's the conventional way to distribute goods, services, opportunities. You just put it on the market, and you use money as a way to allocate that resource. So when I refer to the commodification of opportunity, it's the process by which opportunities are increasingly allocated to those who have money. So you can think of every kid has a certain amount of access to opportunity. If their parents have a lot of money and can buy that opportunity, then that opportunity would be commodified. So here's the rub. In the U.S. and in many other late industrial countries, there's rising income inequality. What's really worrisome about the U.S. case is that just as inequality rises, we're seeing increasing commodification of opportunity. And so the instinct here is that money matters when you can use it for the purposes of buying opportunity. If opportunities are just given to everyone without regard for how much money their parents have, then rising income inequality wouldn't matter, right? It would be a birthright to be given opportunity. But if instead opportunity is meted out to those who have money, if in effect parents have to buy opportunity for their kids, then yeah, rising income inequality is going to matter and matter a lot because you need money to buy opportunity. That's the argument, but I still haven't made it. So let me get to it. So I want you to imagine that you're a poor parent and you love your children and you want them to do well and you want opportunities for them to do well. A lot of poor parents know that their own opportunities are pretty compromised for whatever reason. They're not going to get rich, but they live for their children and hope that their children will do well. So they care deeply, of course, about making it possible for their children to do well. So here are the challenges that in the U.S. that poor parent faces, and they all have to do with the commodification of opportunity. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples of that commodification and why it makes it so hard for the poor parent to provide precisely what they want to provide to their kid, which is opportunity. So here's the first problem. We know it's one of the great achievements, I suppose, of social science. We know that neighborhoods matter profoundly when it comes to opportunity. If you live in a poor neighborhood, it means your children's going to be subjected to a lot of stress, worries about crime. You know that your children are very unlikely to have access to high-quality schooling. You know that your children aren't going to have access to the networks that will assist them in getting ahead. There's all sorts of problems that come out of being in a poor neighborhood. And so what do you want as a parent who cares about your child? You want to get into a decent neighborhood that won't be deeply stressful in ways that we know compromise health and other outcomes, that will provide decent networks, that will provide good schools. Getting into a decent neighborhood is pretty important. Here's the problem. In the US, it costs money, increasingly, to get into precisely this type of neighborhood. It was once the case that there's some amount of economic integration in the US. There was a lottery, if you will, on neighborhoods to some extent. The rich and poor did, to some extent, live in the same neighborhoods, but not now. The rich live with other rich people, the poor live with other poor people. And that's just another way of saying if you want to get into the neighborhood that's high quality, money on the table, right? So that now you got a problem if you're poor in the U.S. The problem is it's really hard to get into a high quality neighborhood. So that's your first problem. Here's another problem. We know that high quality childcare is immensely consequential for kids. If you have high quality childcare, your life chances are immensely improved. So I'm a poor parent again. I love my kids. I know I'm reading the social science literature. I know that high quality childcare is really important. Here's the problem. You got to pay for it, and you don't have the money, right? To some extent, in some states and in some neighborhoods, there's high quality childcare is provided free, but it's pretty rare. So you got a problem. It's on the market. And by the way, it was a little less complicated when childcare was internally provided within the household, but now we've conditioned on an economy in which both parents have to work. So poor kids, poor parents know they have to buy high quality childcare. There's no option of a one-earner family anymore if you want to survive. And so it's been put out on the market, which is fine for people like me because I have enough money to buy it, but it's deeply problematic for poor families. That's opportunity on the market for sale, and hence in this fashion commodified. Okay, third example. It's really useful to have access to a second earning stream. This will cushion against various blows when one of the parents is unemployed, which increasingly happens. We have a gig economy. You're going to be moving in and out of the labor force. You can cushion the blow. You can have insurance against that if your spouse is high earnings, right? So it's increasingly important to have a spouse who can bring in a lot of money if you want to protect your kid against what will otherwise be pretty severe shocks when one of the parents is unemployed. But here's the problem. In order to marry someone in the U.S. who's earning a lot of money, you know what you need? A lot of money. So it takes money to get access to that second stream. Increasingly, the rich are marrying the rich, the poor are marrying the poor. What does that mean? Access to a high earning stream depends on having the money to garner that access. That's, again, the commodification of opportunity. So the implication, opportunity is increasing on the market and for sale. And that means that inequality matters in the United States because opportunity is commodified. Rising income inequality matters, in other words, because you need money to buy opportunity. If opportunity were provided in the way that it's supposed to be provided under the American dream, it would be a birthright. Every kid, no matter how poor or rich their parents might be, would have access to opportunity, not to guaranteed outcomes, right? Just opportunity. But if it's commodified, if we're selling opportunity, if it goes to the highest bidder, then rising income inequality is going to matter because you need money to buy it, and you're relatively disadvantaged then as income inequality increases when you're a poor parent. So the implication is in the US, the intergenerational elasticity should be high and increasing. Let's take a look at what the data say. So we're going to use here a tax return approach. So we have statistics of income data, which is a sample of the tax returns filed in this case in 1987. 1987 is a magical year for people who care about mobility. It's a magical year because it was the first year that the Internal Revenue Service in the United States required parents who wanted to claim a child as a dependent to actually provide the Social Security number of that child. Why? The IRS was concerned that people were just fabricating children so as to get that tax credit. They just made them up. Why wouldn't you? You get a larger refund if you did. But they didn't like that, so they said, well, if you're going to claim a child as a dependent, give us the Social Security of that child, and we're going to make sure that that child exists and isn't being claimed by someone else. So that's in 1987. They did it for their reasons, but for a social scientist, it was very useful because now we have that Social Security number, which can be used to identify that child when she or he grew up. And then the income of that child can be compared to the income of the parent. I should say that as researchers, we didn't ever have access to the Social Security numbers ourselves. All of these analyses were carried out by IRS employees. We just provided the code without seeing the data, and then they ran the code, and then gave us the statistics back, but never any data at all. So there's no security or confidentiality compromises in the least. So what did we find? Not yet. I thought we were going to talk about a little more precursory comments as regards the expectations. And there's a bit of a debate about exactly how high the elasticity in the U.S. is, and it arises because we've had very conflicting estimates. There's a famous review piece by Gary Solon, one of the giants in the field. In 2008, he looked at the available mainly survey data at that time and concluded that, quote, intergenerational earnings elasticity in the U.S. may well be as large as 0.5 or 0.6. So not the one in which you get full conversion for every percent increase of the parents, but pretty good conversion rate. And indeed, if that's right, if Gary Solon is right, if it's as large as 0.5 or 0.6, then the U.S. is a renegade country. It has an elasticity as high as they get in the world. But there's other data from Raj Chetty and his team using tax data, which is gold standard stuff, which had a preferred estimate of 0.34 for the intergenerational income elasticity. So that's much lower and with very good data. And that's a wide range of estimates. You have, on the one hand, 1/3 of percent income differences being translated from parent to the child, and on the other hand, as much as 2/3. Very different policy implications. If we can't nail the estimate better than that, we got a problem, because we don't know if we have a major league problem in which the U.S. is a country with an elasticity higher than that of any other country, or a standard issue country with an elasticity that is about the average for a late industrial country. Which is it? It has pretty important implications for the kind of policy we need to undertake. Is it like radical policy to try to take on a problem that's as large as it is within the late industrial world, or is it just a standard issue problem? So I'm not going to talk about the technical issues that arise in these sorts of analyses, save to note that there are lots of them. You got to correct for life cycle bias, you got to correct for attenuation bias, you got to correct for selection bias, you got to correct for functional form bias. There's a lot of bias. There are a lot of threats. This is not fun work, and I'll just say we did the best we can, the best we could, and that our data were I think, well equipped to handle biases that often could not be dealt with adequately with other sources. So we're pretty confident that we've got some good estimates here, because the data make it uniquely possible to take on these various biases. So what do we find? Finally, the results. This is a representation of the intergenerational earnings elasticity. The x-axis is parental disposable income, the log of it, and the y-axis is the log of the expected earnings. So we care about the slope. It's the extent to which children are benefiting from higher income on the part of their parents. If the line were flat, it would mean it wouldn't matter. where the stork drops you. It would mean no matter how much your parents make, your expected earnings are the same. Now, each of those dots is just the average of all the children that fall within that particular parental percentile, right? So they're scattered around that dot. So a flat line in this case wouldn't mean that everyone's doing the same. It just means that their expectation is the same, that on average they're doing the same, right? That would be the American dream when rendered in this particular fashion. But of course, what we see here is something far from the American dream. There's a very steep slope. It's in fact the average slope, if you average across the small increments making up that line, is 0.56. That puts us at the upper end of the estimates. So the U.S. is running a very high persistence regime. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out here is that the slope gets a little bit steeper as you move to the right. So that left-hand part of the parental income distribution has a slightly less steep slope than the right side. And what's different about those two sections is that one is more decommodified, if you will, than the other. So the left side is where we have a lot of means-tested programs in the U.S. What does a means-tested program mean? It means that income doesn't matter as much because as you earn more, you lose some of the benefits that arise by virtue of the means testing, right? So means testing is just one way to say we're taking opportunity out of the market and we're just going to give it to everyone. If you don't have the money, we'll give it to you anyway on the means test, right? That's happening at the bottom of the distribution. In the middle sectors of the distribution, we don't do means testing anymore, and that means money matters. If you want opportunity, put the money on the table and we'll give you some. If you want to go into a high-quality public school, well, all you have to do is buy your way into the neighborhood that provides them. Put the money on the table. So the simple point that I want to make is when we move into this more commodified zone, what happens? Exactly what you'd expect. You're getting a steeper slope, more of a return to parental income than is the case at the bottom. Okay, so the upshot is the U.S. is a bit of a renegade country. If you compare us to other countries, we have a very high intergenerational elasticity, and my contention is that it's because our decommodified zone is pretty small and weak. Money matters, and hence rising income inequality matters because you need money to buy opportunity. It's for sale in the U.S., and that then means that income inequality is consequential because it gives parents at the top precisely what they need to buy opportunity for their kids, namely money. Okay, last example. Again, the objective is to take a look at whether or not what the Pope claimed is indeed on the mark. Is the Pope right that rising inequality is a source of evil? By this, I'm simply focusing in on the question of the relationship between income inequality, rising income inequality, and mobility. I've shown, I would argue convincingly, that there's a strong relationship between rising income inequality and the decline of absolute economic mobility. I think there's also a strong relationship between rising income inequality and the rising intergenerational elasticity. Now I want to look at the third and equally important type of mobility. It's not economic mobility, but occupation mobility. And sociologists often treat occupation as an omnibus measure of social position, perhaps even more important than simply how much money you make. So we're talking about the difference, say, between ending up as a professional or manager and working as in the craft sector or in the routine manual sector as a laborer. These are consequential differences for your lifestyle. And hence the question is to what extent, say, children who are born into the professional managerial sector are themselves likely to stay in that sector? Or is there an opportunity to move instead from manual laborer to a professional? So this is the kind of question that is taken on within research on occupation mobility. And I'm going to ask again the question, to what extent is rising income inequality going to reduce the amount of occupation mobility? Does it affect occupation mobility too? We've talked about its effects on economic mobility. What about occupation mobility? And I'll focus again on relative mobility here. So if you want to look at the effects of rising income inequality on occupation mobility, you got to look at in the right place. So where's the right place? You want to find out which parents are actually profiting from rising income inequality and then can use that in assisting their children. And you know which? It's the professionals and managers. They're the ones who are profiting from rising income inequality. Most of the increase in income inequality takes the form of professional and managers getting more money. Okay? So you can see this in the graph that I've shown here. It's a representation of mean family income by the social class of a household head. You have, most importantly, a top line that pertains to professionals and managers. And the rest of the lines beneath that top line pertain to some of the other occupations. Manual and non-manual occupations that are below the professional and managerial occupations. So what do you see here? You see the professional managerial sector pulling away from all the others, right? So there's no splaying out of the lines below the professional managerial lines. There's not rising income inequality across the other occupations. But where you see a change is in the payoff to being in that professional and managerial sector. So if there's anywhere that you would expect an effect of rising income inequality, it would be in the professional and managerial sector. They're the ones who are getting all the extra money, right? So you might ask, what are they doing with that money? It's not inconceivable. It's not inconceivable to say, well, you know, I live in America. It's the land of opportunity. And so even though I had more money, I will definitely not use it to help my kids. That would be wrong. That's not what happens. And you know, understandably, right? As parents, our profound responsibility is to our kids. And if we have the capacity to help them, we're going to help them, right? Of course we should help them. And that's indeed what seems to be the case. So this is a graph by Sabino Kornrich and Frank Furstenberg. There's some other research by Jane Waldvogel and others that shows the same thing. What it basically shows is that those at the top are using their extra money that comes about because of rising income inequality. They're using their extra money to help their kids. They're spending that money on their kids. Not exclusively on their kids, but they're using that money on the various things, on various expenditures for their kids that will provide opportunity for their kids. So they're going to use that money to get into high amenity neighborhoods that will help their kids. They'll get high quality childcare. They'll buy after school assistance in camps. They'll buy that finishing school vacation in Europe. They'll do what they think. They're making all sorts of bets about what it is that will help their kids, and they're using that extra money that rising income inequality implies. They're using it to spend more on their kids. Dollars in thousands. So this is just a representation of which social classes are getting more money over time. Sorry, that was the last graph. This graph, jet lag, sorry, that's my excuse, from here on in. This graph is rather about the amount of money that each decile is spending on their kids. And it's just showing that the top decile, which now has more money than was the case in the past, the top decile is spending a lot of their money on kids, on their kids. Okay. So I'm not going to go into the results in any detail, except to say that in a paper with Pablo Mitnick, Aaron Cumberwith, and myself, using the General Social Survey, we found that if you're born into the professional managerial class, if your parents are in that class, you're increasingly likely over time to remain in that class. So parents in that class have been more successful over time in transferring that very privileged standing to their kids. It's about a 20% increase. The problem is, because the General Social Survey is so small, that change, that 20% increase, was only significant at the borderline level. Now, I should also say that with respect to all other types of reproduction, like, for example, the capacity of parents who are in the manual sector to transfer their class position to their children, those were unchanged. There's no evidence of change. The only place where we saw change was in professional managerial reproduction. But recall, that's exactly where you'd expect to find change under the income inequality hypothesis. The class that profited from rising income inequality was the professional managerial class, and that's the class that's had more success over time in transferring their position to their children. But only with borderline significance, because the general social survey is small. Now, I had hoped when young me long ago asked what I was going to talk about, I'd hoped to be able to present data from linked census that would allow us to have many, many more cases and weigh in much more definitively on this. We actually have the results, but they haven't been vetted yet by the Census Bureau, so I can't tell you what they are. So I ended up coming here a little too early, and so I can only tell you about the General Social Survey analysis, but it is consistent with the argument. That analysis is. I will say nothing about the other analysis. Okay. Because I can't. But so here's the summary. There are 3 mechanical reasons why high inequality societies have less mobility. Let me just review them. I want to convince you that our worst worries with respect to the effects of rising income inequality have been borne out with respect to this particular type of outcome. So when it comes to absolute economic mobility, the basic finding here is that it's really lousy way to distribute growth. That is to distribute it just to those at the top, to give almost all the growth to the 1%. That's a really lousy decision if your objective is to maximize the amount of absolute economic mobility. It'd be far better to distribute that growth widely, giving lots of kids the capacity to beat their parents. If you're going to do it the way we do it now, in a very unequal way where most of the growth goes to the top, one of the costs, you may still think it's good, but one of the costs, and we should own up to that, one of the costs is going to be we're not going to have a lot of absolute mobility. Okay, so that's point 1. Point 2 is that when you shift to relative mobility, not absolute mobility, but relative mobility, if you ask to what extent children are advantaged by virtue of being dropped into a high-income household as opposed to a low-income household, if that's your question, then you have to think about commodification. If you live in a highly commodified society where opportunity is for sale on the market, if you live in that kind of society, then rising income inequality is going to matter a lot because you need money to buy opportunity for your kids. And the evidence with respect to intergenerational elasticities bears out, I think, that type of argument. And then finally, if you care about occupation mobility, and in particular the extent to which the most desirable positions in the economy, the professional managerial positions, the extent to which they're transferred from parent to child, when you have rising income inequality and the professional managerial sector is getting a lot of that increase, they're getting the extra money, then they're going to have more capacity. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty mechanical. They're going to have more capacity to help their kids get those professional managerial positions themselves. So for 3 core types of mobility about which we care, rising income inequality seems to be pretty consequential, and the Pope was on the mark to worry, at least with respect to the mobility domain, which is a pretty important commitment. Okay, so that's my summary of the evidence, and I want to turn now to the question of what's to be done. Well, so one possibility is nothing. You could say, well, I think rising income inequality has lots of payoffs in a lot of other domains that are good. I want you to show me that evidence, but you could say that. And I'm willing to take the hit on mobility, and I'm not going to do anything. Even though in the U.S. a commitment to the American dream and mobility and opportunity is pretty profound commitment, you could say, I'm going to sacrifice that because of these other benefits that inequality delivers. So that's one option. Do nothing. It's a trade-off. You always have to make hard decisions, and I'm going to sacrifice mobility for other benefits. That's possible. But if you're not willing to make that trade-off, If you think the commitment to equal opportunity and mobility is a pretty important one, then you got to figure out how you're going to do something about it. And I'm going to suggest here that there are two options. So one possibility is to address the inequality. So if rising income inequality is the problem, well, let's take it on at its source and reduce inequality. Now that says that we're going to acquiesce to commodification. We're okay with putting opportunity on the market. We can say that genie's out of the bottle. There's nothing we can do about that. But if opportunity is going to be on the market, if we're going to mete it out in accord with the parents' ability to pay for it, then we got to give parents at the bottom of the income distribution a little more capacity to buy opportunity for their kids. It's on the market. That's done. That's over. That game's up. But we do have a commitment to allowing even the children who are dropped into poor families some amount of opportunity. So let's give their parents a bit more money so they can buy opportunity for their kids, buy high-quality childcare, buy the other things that they know will give opportunity to their kids. So that's just a redistribution problem. That's one option. The other option is to say, we can live with high income inequality. And it's going to be very hard to get any amount of support for a redistribution exercise in the US. That's difficult, right? So let's not take that on, however much we might want to. That's impossible. But we can take on the commodification problem. So we can say, look, when we can identify a good or a service that's critical for delivering opportunity to kids, like say early childhood education, let's just provide that to all kids. Take it out of the market. Let's decommodify a bit. We decommodify very carefully and strategically. We only take those things out of the market that we know matter for opportunity. So that's the decommodification approach. I would argue that you got to do one or the other if you want to rescue the American dream. So let me just conclude with what we need to do as social scientists insofar as either one of those approaches is to be undertaken. Let's start with the decommodification approach. So this is a tall order when you're moving away from the market to allocate goods, services, opportunities, and you're going to now put it into the public sector. It's a tall order if you want to do it efficiently. You're basically replacing the invisible hand with the visible hand, right? We need to decide. So what does the visible hand have to do? It's got two jobs here. It's got to identify which services we're going to deliver. Is it going to be early education? Is it going to be workforce development? What are the many services that are most important in delivering opportunity to kids? We need social science to tell us that. We need the visible hand to tell us that. And then we have to know how to best to deliver them. There's lots of ways to deliver high-quality early childhood education. What's the best way at the lowest cost? We need social science to deliver on that too, right? So it's a tall order when you're going to the visible hand. And in the talk that I'll be giving tomorrow, I'm going to focus on exactly what we need to do in order to deliver on that, to deliver a very efficient visible hand. And it requires building a big data infrastructure with integrated linked data that will allow us to evaluate programs and figure out which ones are working and which ones aren't. We actually have the capacity to do this, to deliver a social science that can weigh in on which programs are working and which aren't. We can deliver a very efficient visible hand. We now have the capacity. It's not easy, but it's well within our capacity to do just that. I'll talk a bit also tomorrow in that lecture about how California is committed to taking on poverty and how we're trying to build precisely this type of big data infrastructure so that we can assist in that effort. But the point here is, it's not easy to develop to deliver on the promise of the invisible hand either, by the way, right? The invisible hand, we know we have loads of market failure, we have loads of information problems, loads of transaction costs that are making very hard for the invisible hand to deliver, right? It's also hard for the visible hand to deliver, but we have the capacity to make that work in ways that are pretty exciting. And that's what we need to do if we're going to engage in decommodification. We have to, again, deliver on the question of which programs are most effective in providing opportunity to kids, and how best then to deliver those programs. And we can do that. That's how big data are critical insofar as you go down the decommodification road. But what if you go down the other road? What if you say, well, it's really hard to decommodify. We're living in a society in which everything is about commodification, putting everything in the market, and we can never decommodify. That's too hard. And so I'm going to approach the inequality side of the equation and try to reduce the amount of inequality. There's a lot of folks who are working at that, on that question in California and elsewhere, and in particular in California and throughout the U.S. In fact, we're very interested in basic income. It's an extraordinary new development. And that's one way, just one way. There are many ways to equalize with respect to the income distribution, but basic income is one way. But if you want to seriously think about basic income in the U.S. or in any country, you're going to have to carry out the requisite experiments to figure out what that's going to do, right? I mean, there have been some basic income experiments, but we want an experiment that assesses the effects of delivering a basic income right now in the context of the late industrial world as we now see it, and that also is predicated on lots of the changes that have obtained since the last experiment. So we definitely need to run that experiment. It's a big, radical policy change. But that experiment can only be well delivered within, again, the administrative infrastructure that I've described. It provides a context for assessing the effects of a basic income and then monitoring how people react using administrative data. And I'll talk about that in the next lecture as well. So either way that you go, either reducing inequality or decommodifying is going to require a big data infrastructure of the sort that social science can provide. And I think there's lots of opportunity to make this next big experiment in how to restore the American dream a very successful one, no matter which way we go. Now, last slide. Are these two experiments that I've talked about enough? And I think not at all. We're at a crossroads, I think, in the U.S. One of our most profound commitments is not being delivered on. We pay lip service like every 4 years to the idea of the American dream and equal opportunity. It's just lip service. So we're letting one of our most sacred commitments just disappear. And so I think it's time to take on the problem with pretty bold policy. I've talked about a few of them, like basic income is a type of radical redistribution. I think we should also start talking about radical decommodification and carry out the experiments so as to assess what the effects of radical decommodification would be. But that's not enough. Those are two radical approaches to try to restore the American dream, but I would suggest that we should start engaging in serious testing of other approaches so that we're well positioned to make this decision about how to react. We should talk about radical desegregation of our neighborhoods. I don't see anything that's about the American experience that says that poor people should live with poor people and rich people should live with rich people and they should never come in contact with one another. That doesn't strike me as something that's fundamental to the country that I love. We should start experimenting with integration, living together. Income inequality, fine, have tons of it, but it shouldn't be the case that the poor and rich never even come into contact with one another. So let's carry out some radical experiments with integrating our neighborhoods. And then as a final example of the kind of bold policy in which I think we should engage and experiment with and start debating in a serious way, radical employment policy, public jobs. We have a huge jobs problem in the U.S., and we should start thinking about getting some of the work done that needs to get done that isn't being delivered in the private sector, and seeing whether or not a public jobs program could solve those problems and restore the American dream. So I think there's lots of opportunities. I think we need to think boldly and use recent advances in big data and in social science to start testing some of these bold ideas and do what my country is supposed to do well, which is to recognize that it's a social world that we create, that we construct, that's under our control, and modify our institutions in ways that are consistent with our commitments. That's the fundamental American dream, and so I think we should get to that job in a way that distressingly we haven't in recent decades. Thank you very much.